How are you all today? May we all always be in God's care. Today's story title is We thought the tour guide in the haunted museum was just a man in full armor until we realized all the suits of armor were supposed to be empty. The Crimson and Ivory Museum of Military History should have been closed since 5 o'clock, but here we stood, a select group of 7, or perhaps cursed, to experience its exclusive night tour. The main lights were dead, leaving only track lighting that carved islands of brilliance in the overwhelming darkness, illuminating dioramas and glass cases in a way that made the wax figures and antique weapons seem to watch us. Our footsteps echoed with a hollow, lonely sound on the marble floors, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that clung to the air, thick with the smell of old wood, polish, and something else, something metallic and ancient. It was supposed to be a unique, thrilling experience for history buffs like myself, but as the giant oak doors groaned shut behind us, the thrill quickly began to curdle into a deep, unsettling dread. This wasn't the quiet, educational atmosphere of the daytime. This was the museum's true face, stripped bare and sleeping, and we were uninvited guests trespassing in its dreams. He emerged from the shadows near a display of medieval broadswords, and his appearance was so startlingly dramatic that a few of us gasped. Our guide was a living exhibit, clad from head to toe in a suit of ornate 15th century Gothic plate armor. The steel was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the dim lights in distorted, dancing shards. "Welcome," his voice boomed, a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but through the very floor, a sound that was impossibly deep for a human voice projected through a sealed helmet. "I am your custodian for this evening. You may address me as the Curator." He moved with slow, deliberate grace, the metal plates sliding against each other with a soft, continuous hiss of steel on steel that was far too quiet, far too fluid. There was no grunt of effort, no clumsy shifting of weight that one would expect from a man carrying 60 pounds of metal. It was as if the armor itself was alive and moving of its own volition. The tour began conventionally enough, with the curator leading us through the Age of Blades wing. His knowledge was encyclopedic, terrifyingly so. He didn't just recite beats and facts. He spoke of the weight of a longsword in a knight's grip, the specific sound a poleaxe made when it shattered collarbones, the precise shade of crimson a wound would bloom on linen. His narration was a sensory overload, too vivid, too personal. "Feel the balance here," he'd say, his gauntleted hand hovering over a glass case containing a Viking axe, and I could almost swear I felt a phantom weight in my own hand. During one of his pauses, a young woman named Sarah, a fellow history student, leaned over to me, her face pale in the eerie light. "His voice," she whispered, her breath misting in the suddenly cold air. "It's not coming from the helmet's visor. It's echoing from the center of the breastplate. like there's a speaker inside his chest cavity. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. The moment that shattered any illusion of normalcy came in the Art of Siege room. A man named Ben, a loud, skeptical engineer who had been joking all evening, decided to test his theory. As the curator described the siege of the castle, Ben, pretending to stumble, reached out and placed his hand firmly on the curator's armored back to steady himself. The reaction was instantaneous. Ben yelped and snatched his hand back as if burned. "It's freezing," he hissed to me, his eyes wide with confusion that was rapidly turning into fear. "And it's not hollow. I felt solid mass underneath, but it was rigid, unyielding, like pressing on a stone statue." From within the helmet, the curator's head didn't turn, but his voice rolled out, now laced with a subtle, chilling amusement. "It is considered poor form to touch the artifacts, sir. Some of them still have sharp edges, and some memories are still fresh." He then continued his lecture without missing a beat, as if nothing had happened, leaving us all frozen in a new kind of terror. We finally stopped in the grand hall, dominated by a full-scale replica of a knight on a warhorse, both in full barding. The curator stood before it, a silent brother to the silent statue. This concludes the formal portion of our tour. The museum is now yours to explore for a short while. I would advise against straying into the unlit corridors. The past can be a labyrinth, and not all who enter find their way back to the present. He fell then completely still, so profoundly motionless that he became one with the other exhibits. We stood there, a huddled group of 7, utterly alone in the cavernous, shadow-infested hall. The initial intellectual curiosity had been completely devoured by a primal, gut-wrenching fear. We weren't on a tour anymore. We were specimens in a cage, and the keeper was not what he seemed. The real horror was just beginning, and the only thing louder than the silence was the relentless whispering hiss of steel that still seemed to linger in our ears. The curator's absolute stillness was more terrifying than his movement. He became a statue, a grotesque, polished cenotaph in the center of the hall, reflecting our own pale, frightened faces back at us in warped caricatures. For a full minute, nobody spoke, the only sounds being our own ragged breathing and the frantic staccato rhythm of Sarah's camera shutter as she, operating on some desperate historian's instinct, began documenting him. "We need to leave, now," Ben finally hissed, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by a raw, trembling urgency. He was cradling his right hand, the one that had touched the armor, as if it were injured. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong with that thing. It's not a man in a suit." His words hung in the cold air, giving voice to the dread we all felt, but had been too afraid to articulate. It was then that Mark, the youngest in our group, pointed a shaking finger towards the far end of the hall, where a dark, arched corridor branched off from the main gallery. "The main entrance is locked from the outside," he stammered. "I checked while he was talking, but he mentioned an emergency exit through the armory of the Republic wing." This sparked a frantic, whispered debate. Lisa, An older woman who had been quiet until now argued for staying put, for waiting until some predetermined end time. This is still part of the show, a psychological thrill. They can't just keep us here, she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. Ben and I argued for movement, for action. The oppressive weight of the curator's silent presence was crushing our sanity. Every second we stood there, we could feel the museum itself, watching, waiting. Our hushed argument was violently interrupted by the curator. Without a single visible muscle twitching, without the faintest scrape of metal, his voice emanated from the armor, smooth and conversational, yet it made us all jump. The Armory of the Republic showcases the evolution of firearm warfare from the 18th to the 20th century. A fascinating study in impersonal death. His helmet remained facing forward, but the voice was clear, directed solely at us. Sarah, emboldened by fear, took a step forward. "Who are you, really?" she demanded, her voice cracking. There was a long, heavy pause, filled only by the thumping of my own heart. Then the voice returned, softer, almost a whisper that seemed to come from just behind my ear. "I am the memory of this place, the echo of a final breath held within steel. I am the last man standing and the first to fall. Does that satisfy your curiosity, child of a forgetful age?" Driven by a desperate need to escape both the entity and the suffocating grandeur of the main hall, our group, now a tightly packed herd, scurried towards the dark archway leading to the armory wing. The moment we crossed the threshold, the character of the museum changed entirely. The air grew colder and smelled of old gunpowder, oil, and dust. The lighting was even sparser, with vast pools of absolute blackness between the exhibits of muskets, rifles, and machine guns. We had gone only about 20 feet when a new sound joined our frantic footsteps. A slow, rhythmic, metallic clink, 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 keeping perfect time from the darkness behind us. We stopped. It stopped. We hurried forward, the pace of the clinking quickened to match ours. It was the sound of an armored footfall, but it was all wrong. It was too heavy, too solid, as if each step was driving a nail into the marble. We broke into a run, a blind panic dash through the maze of glass cases. The clink, clink, clink erupted into a full, thunderous, metallic sprint, a horrifying cacophony that echoed off the walls, sounding less like one set of footsteps and more like an entire platoon giving chase. We rounded a corner into a dead-end room displaying World War I trench warfare artifacts. A reconstructed muddy trench, barbed wire, and a heavy, rusted machine gun. Trapped, we spun around, hearts in our throats, ready to face our pursuer. But the corridor behind us was empty. The sprinting footsteps had vanished. The only thing that remained was the voice of the curator, which now seemed to come from the rusted machine gun itself. A dry, rasping whisper. "You rush toward the instruments of death, thinking them sanctuary? How amusing! The exit you seek is here, but to open it, one of you must take the place of the last sentry who stood his post." He has grown very lonely. The curator's words. One of you must take the place of the last sentry, hung in the frigid air of the trench exhibit, a venomous offer that seeped into our souls. The initial blind panic of the chase crystallized into a cold, hard knot of despair. We were trapped in a dead-end room designed to resemble a tomb, the irony of which was not lost on any of us. Ben slammed his fists against the false, rough-hewn wall at the end of the trench, a guttural roar of frustration tearing from his throat. "It's a dead end! A goddamn dead end!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. Lisa began to sob quietly, her earlier optimism utterly shattered, while Mark frantically scanned the room, his eyes wide with the primal need for an escape that simply wasn't there. It was Sarah, ever the academic, even in the face of the impossible, who first noticed the anomaly. "The machine gun," she whispered, her voice trembling but focused. "The placard says it's a replica, but look at it." We all turned. The heavy, water-cooled Vickers gun was mounted on a tripod, caked in what looked like ancient dried mud. But as we stared, a single glistening drop of moisture formed at the end of the barrel and fell, hitting the faux wooden deck with a soft, distinct plink. Then another. "It's sweating?" Mark breathed out, horrified. The air around the gun seemed to warp, and a phantom scent of cordite and wet wool, overpowering the museum's dust, filled our nostrils. The curator's voice was absent, but his presence was now infused into the very artifact, a silent, waiting menace. The silence was broken by a new, slow, and deliberate sound from the corridor we had just fled down. Clink, drag, clink, drag. It was the sound of a wounded soldier, or something imitating one, slowly and inexorably approaching our position. With each dragging step, the single bulb illuminating our trench room flickered violently, casting the room into strobing snapshots of terror. In the bursts of light, we could see a figure materializing at the entrance to the room. It was another suit of armor, but this one was different. A tattered, mud-caked uniform from the Great War, a rusted helmet obscuring its face, and one leg bent at an unnatural angle, accounting for the dragging sound. In its gloved hands, it held a bayonet-tipped rifle, the point aimed directly at our huddled group. "Who's there?" Ben shouted, his voice a desperate challenge. The World War I soldier didn't respond with words. Instead, it raised a single trembling gloved hand and pointed its index finger slowly, moving from one of us to the next, a macabre game of eeny, meeny, miny, moe. Its gaze, felt rather than seen from the deep shadow of its helmet, finally settled and stopped, pointing directly at Lisa. The moment it did, the dragging steps ceased. The soldier stood perfectly still, its bayonet unwavering. A low, mournful sigh, like wind through a ruined battlefield, echoed from its direction. The implication was horrifyingly clear. The last sentry had made its choice. It wanted a replacement, and it had chosen Lisa. Chaos erupted. Lisa screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and scrambled backward into the fake trench wall, clawing at it uselessly. "No, no, please!" Ben, to his credit, surged forward, placing himself between Lisa and the spectral soldier. "You want to fight? Fine! Fight me, you piece of scrap metal!" he roared. The soldier's head tilted slowly, almost curiously. Then the curator's voice filled the room once more, but this time it was layered, as if 100 dying soldiers were speaking in unison through the static of a dead radio signal. "Bravery is commendable, but it will not open the door. Only a trade will suffice. The weary must be relieved. It is the oldest law of the god." As the last word echoed, a previously hidden outline in the wall behind the machine gun shimmered into view. A simple, unmarked emergency exit door, its red light now glowing faintly. It was there. Freedom was literally feet away, held behind a price none of us were willing to pay. The glowing red exit sign above the door was a taunt, a promise of salvation dangled before us at a price so monstrous it froze the very blood in our veins. Lisa's pleading whimpers were the only human sound in the room, a stark counterpoint to the low electronic hum of the sign and the oppressive spectral silence of the World War I soldier, whose bayonet remained unwaveringly fixed on her. "We are not doing this," I said, my voice sounding hollow and far less convincing than I intended. "We are not sacrificing anyone. There has to be another way." Ben, his body still tensed like a spring in front of Lisa, nodded fiercely, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his bravado. He knew, as we all did, that we were not arguing with a man, but with the very bricks and mortar of this cursed place, with the echoes of dead warriors who understood nothing but duty and replacement. It was Mark who broke the stalemate, not with courage, but with a desperate, selfish impulse that would haunt me forever. His eyes, wide with a feral panic, darted from the soldier to Lisa, then to the exit. What if it just wants a soul?" he whispered, but the acoustics of the dead-end room carried his words to all of us. "What if it doesn't have to be her?" Before anyone could process his meaning, he made a frantic, lurching movement, shoving Sarah sideways, directly into the path of the soldier's pointing bayonet. The spectral entity's head swiveled with a sound of grinding rust, its focus instantly shifting from Lisa to the now terrified Sarah. It was a monstrous gamble, a betrayal that sucked the air from the room. The soldier took a heavy, dragging step forward, its interest now clearly on the new, more viable target. A scream of pure, unadulterated rage erupted from Ben. "You coward!" he roared, and in a move born of protective fury, he lunged not at the soldier but at the tripod of the heavy, sweating machine gun. With a grunt of immense effort, he swung the entire massive assembly around, positioning the rusted barrel directly at the advancing specter. "Stay back!" he screamed at it. For a moment, nothing happened. The soldier continued its slow, dragging advance. Then the curator's voice, now cold and devoid of its earlier theatricality, echoed from the trench walls themselves. "You desecrate the instrument. You do not command it." As the words faded, the machine gun in Ben's hands began to tremble violently, not with recoil, but with a malevolent life of its own. The rusted metal grew searingly hot, and a phantom skeletal hand, a thing of bone and ghostly matter, materialized over Ben's, gripping the trigger. A deafening, chattering roar exploded in the confined space, but it was a sound from a nightmare. No bullets emerged from the barrel. Instead, with each phantom shot, a visible wave of concussive force shimmering like a heat haze blasted from the gun. It didn't hit the World War I soldier. It passed through it, causing the specter to flicker like a bad signal, but continue its advance. The blasts, however, struck Ben full in the chest. There was no physical wound, no blood, but he screamed, a sound of utter, soul-rending agony. He staggered back, his hands releasing the burning hot metal, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the physical. He wasn't being shot, he was being unmade. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, as the phantom machine gun fell silent, its spectral operator gone. The World War I soldier was now only feet away, its bayonet inches from a paralyzed Sarah. Ben looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and in them I saw a horrifying clarity. He had drawn its aggression. He had become the conflict. And in the twisted logic of this place, the sentry needed relief from its eternal vigil, not just a body, but a soul steeped in the violence of its domain. With a final resigned look at Sarah, he whispered, "Go." Then he turned and threw himself not at the soldier, but into the machine gun, his body passing through the metal and the tripod in a shower of ethereal sparks. The moment he did, the World War I soldier dissolved into a wisp of mist, and the emergency exit door swung open with a definitive hydraulic hiss. The trade was complete. Ben had taken the sentry's place. The hydraulic hiss of the door was the most beautiful and most horrifying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of freedom, paid for with a man's soul. For a moment, none of us moved, trapped in the stunned silence that followed Ben's sacrifice. The trench room was now just a museum display again. The machine gun was inert, cold, and rusted. The phantom sense of war vanished. But the memory of Ben's face, that final look of terrible understanding before he dissolved into the artifact, was seared into my mind. Sarah, who he had died to save, was weeping uncontrollably, her body shaking with tremors that seemed like they would never stop. Mark could not meet anyone's eyes, his face a mask of shame and relief, having triggered the chain of events that led to this terrible conclusion. We were broken, a fellowship shattered by the museum's cruel transactional logic. Our flight from the armory of the Republic was a blind, frantic scramble. We burst through the exit door not into the blessed outside world, but into another section of the museum, the Grand Hall of Flags, a vast open space with banners hanging from a vaulted ceiling high above. The main entrance, with its giant oak doors, was on the far side, a beacon of hope under the dim emergency lighting. "There, the main doors," I yelled, my voice hoarse. We ran, our footsteps echoing in the enormous space, driven by the single, primal instinct to escape the oppressive, sentient weight of the building. We were almost halfway across, the exit so close we could almost feel the night air, when a familiar, resonant voice stopped us dead in our tracks, its tone one of almost parental disappointment. "Did you truly believe it would be that simple?" The curator's voice did not come from one place, but from all around us. "A transaction has been made, a balance restored in one wing, but a museum is a collection, and this collection requires a new curator." As the words echoed, the main entrance doors slammed shut with a boom that shook the floor, followed by the heavy, distinct sound of iron deadbolts sliding into place. From the shadows of every alcove and corridor that fed into the hall, figures began to emerge. Not just the Gothic knight we first knew, but dozens of them. A Roman legionary in segmented plate, a Napoleonic guardsman, the World War I soldier from the trench now standing tall, a silent, spectral army representing every era of conflict housed within these walls. They formed a semicircle, blocking our path to the exit, a wall of polished, rusted, and tarnished steel. The original curator, in his ornate Gothic armor, stepped forward from the ranks. He raised his gauntleted hand, and this time we all saw it clearly. There was no seam, no joint where a human hand could be. It was a solid, articulated piece of metal. You have witnessed the truth of this place. It is not a repository of artifacts, but a prison for warrior spirits too stubborn or too violent to fade. I, too, was once a visitor who outstayed his welcome. My body has long since turned to dust within this shell. My consciousness is now the will of the collection, and the collection must grow. He then pointed that solid metal finger not at one of us, but directly at me. You did not cower. You did not betray. You sought a path until the very end. You have the resilience this duty demands. You will become the new voice for the collection, the new memory within the steel. A paralyzing cold, far deeper than any temperature, seized my limbs. I felt an invisible force pulling me toward him, not physically, but spiritually, as if my very essence was being drawn out. "Fight it!" Sarah screamed, but her voice sounded miles away. I could feel the memories of 1,000 battles that were not my own flooding my mind. The fear of a cavalry charge, the agony of a musket ball, the cold steel of a bayonet finding its mark. I was being overwritten, my identity dissolved to make room for the aggregate consciousness of the museum's dead. The curator's armor began to glow with a faint, ethereal light, and I could see the ghostly outline of the previous occupant, a sorrowful, trapped spirit, finally beginning to fade, its eternal vigil ending as mine began. The last thing I saw was Sarah and Mark being forcibly escorted, not by the soldiers, but by a sudden, unnatural wind that blew them toward a small, previously unnoticed service door that opened up, offering them escape. They were being released, not out of mercy, but to become witnesses, to spread the legend. The museum needed new visitors. As my vision darkened and the cold steel of the curator's consciousness encased my soul, my final coherent thought wasn't my own. It was the first lesson of the new curator, a whisper that echoed in the silent hall for no one but me to hear. The exit was never the door. The exit is a successor. The tour was over. The collection was secure, and I was its newest and now eternal exhibit.